Practicing the piano, it's really repetitive. Everybody knows that. What is so important is to pay attention in every detail, but at the same time organize the map for the brain to picture the whole. If you do only the detail, the micro, but you don't plan the macro, the staged, organized path of the brain through the thinking how you play the piece, just like car lights at night, low beams or high beams. And you can use a partner to cover the beginning of each bar, which you play to force you to visually watch the next bar of the score, even if you know the piece. Not only sight reading it, but when you already know it, to force yourself when you look at the score to always think where this pattern leads you, to organize brain vitamins of awareness, so to say, about how to not have the repetitivity of the practicing dull your attention. And it's easy to say, difficult to do, because we mostly repeat in practicing in order to gain some kind of subconscious awareness of the elements in the muscular memory of the performance. And to a certain extent, for some sections where there's a lot of information to process for the brain in terms of the playing patterns of the awareness of the cognitive facts, you also have to have at the same time the conductor who doesn't play but conducts the orchestra, awareness of what you do by counting or group of bars and organizing the pacing of the flow of the events so that the information irrigates your brain ahead of time for what you're going to do, especially when, let's say, the texture is less complex and you have more time to, let's say, be disconnected from the concentration. I mean, one thing is to be just completely overtaken by the complexity of playing, therefore the energy that it takes to play, it's its own brain drain. But when you have less to play, you have to think more about where it leads you. And the memorization is, of course, partly muscular memory, but it's also analytical awareness, tonalities, where you're formally in the piece, so that you have a GPS embedded in your awareness while you go through the paths. And just like a beautiful garden that you might be familiar with has different paths that you could take to go from point A to point B, but you know still where you are, you're not lost, it's not a maze. That's what you should do also when you practice, in order to imagine how it will be when you think you're almost lost, because you know how to go back to the road through another, let's say, side road, because you picture it. And that brings me to the hearing awareness while practicing, and not disconnecting that hearing awareness because of the repetitivity through the practicing of the fingers. Inevitably, the piece is played in public or in friends or in a jury audition, exam, recital, whatever. It has to be played in the sequence of the events of the composition of the piece. No matter how well or practical you can be when you practice the individual sections or elements or patterns, if it's variations or thematic materials, whatever it is, but to play it in the sequence physically in order to not get tired or tense in the wrists or in the arms, is also mentally to know how to appropriately enter in the new section so that you can play it at best. Is no artistry without technique. You have to have the best technical approach for each section. Therefore, the hearing level has to be so much the monitor awareness that you do when you play in public throughout the piece. In a way, it displays itself in its own chronology of events as composed by the composer. And no more individual sections put together, scotch taped to become the piece. No, it's not slices of thoughts or slices of sections put together. It's a flow of events where the sections come in their place, and you have to then be aware of how it sounds literally, and not only how it feels under the fingers, because when you play it in public and you play it through without stopping or hoping not to, and without hesitating for the memory, either it's visual, either it's finger, but the awareness of the hearing can become almost disruptive. Has often happened in my experience to observe how students who know very well their piece get lost in it, mostly because I assume, and that's what I gained to discover through the years of teaching, that we disconnect our hearing awareness when we repetitively practice, and when we play through the piece less often than when we practice its separate sections, the awareness of what we hear almost surprises us. It's like I don't recognize the piece I'm playing when I'm displaying it, rather than when I partially practice each section in order to master the micro details compared to the macro performance of the piece. So what does it take? Performance experience? Yes. Partly. And partly it takes also awareness of the piece outside of the performance finger actually playing on the keys. It can be writing it down on a table, or closing your eyes in meditation and imagining you're playing the piece and hearing it in your inner ears, as if you're playing it, and to see how you can again manage that flow of the display of the events. And then create, while you play the piece, a second track that will be your brain track, that, like the high beams of the car at night, gives you enough foresight where you're going, perhaps 2 bars, perhaps a phrase, perhaps depending of the tempo and the length of the bars and how it's notated, but generally enough for your brain to not be having to process things on the spot, because okay, you can manage the unexpected to a certain point, because some things always come out differently. The keyboard doesn't feel the same on an instrument that has a heavier keyboard, the acoustics, the blurriness. I mean, all kinds of aspects that should, if the awareness is not really separate from the fingers, shouldn't disturb you or shouldn't make you vulnerable. You should be able to display all what you know of the piece on any keyboard. Well, that's another story that is easier to say than to do. But on the practicing daily routine, I really think that I've come to the conclusion that one has to be highly aware of what one hears compared to what one reads, compared to what one plays, and put it all together in one, without bypassing the one over the other. They sort of mutually nourish your awareness of the piece at several levels: the hearing, the feeling, and the knowledge outside of the playing. In this way, some sections will be more one or the other, and then at some point of repetitive performances of the piece, with things that went well or no, with time you gain to know which are the sections that you're more vulnerable to for your mental awareness of it. Is it because of the polyphony of an element, or a fingering, or just a way of handling the keyboard display of a key that is, according to your morphology of the hand, more or less convenient to organize differently. Of course, that is something you do when you study, learn, and project yourself in performance, and you practice under tempo, but then you'll play in tempo. Therefore, what I wanted to really emphasize here is keep your focused concentration and hearing on high alert, even during practicing repetitively the piece or the section or group of sections. So you go from the syllable to the words, to the sentence, to the stanza or to the paragraph, to the page or to the chapter in a book or in a writing, so that you can be always aware where you are in the piece, as if you're flying high over the score while you're playing the details of it. So the micro and the macro are in fact communicating, and you're not lost in space, and you have your GPS with you, with the awareness of it. So handwriting sections can help. Practicing them repetitively with awareness of what the resonances, the suspensions, the appoggiaturas, the ornaments, all the effects of the music produce, is the ingredients, and then the spices. It's all these things that make the music which you play be a discourse, a statement, a state of the mind as well as of the mood, and combined, whichever way you connect to, have several aspects of connecting to it that allow you to be reliable with time, but also in the early stages of the knowledge of the piece. Of course, ideally, you should be able to revisit a piece after you learn it on the score. And harpsichordists or conductors are allowed, for instance, to play in public with a score, even if they don't read it, but it's there. Either because it's an awareness for the group as a conductor, if you have to pick it up, unless you can memorize even the rehearsal numbers, which some do. Or for the harpsichordists compared to the pianists, it's acceptable. But since Liszt started the concert recital trend from memory in public with tailcoat for men, of course, all this recital project brings us to have pianists expected to play everything from memory. And for students, the memory is sometimes what takes so much of their brain power that they don't have time to even process the music they make, just to be staying on the road while they play, to avoid memory slip. And so with performance practice, of course, you get to have this after the second or third or fourth re-guessing, I was going to say rather, re-meeting with the piece. And you say, I'm going to leave it now for if I have the luxury of time compared to deadlines of performance expectation, to let it sink in after I learned it without memorizing, but really in depth from the score, and then go back to it to memorize it after you have already let it macerate, penetrate your subconscious level to a certain extent. And then you see what you're missing, and you add the pieces that are missing to connect the dots. And then you memorize it, and then you let it go, and you go back to it 6 months, a year or later. In other words, it takes several, call it revisitations, until the piece becomes you, subconscious. Really, it becomes you, like your mother tongue. You speak it without to think. Then, of course, you think to organize your thoughts, you think to organize your words, your choice of words, but it is something that becomes very natural to your expression, rather than something that you're trying to hastily put together for the fingers and the memory. Now, it is true that in school time, one doesn't have the luxury to have the time that it takes to do this revisiting through, let's say, months or years. So it has to be squeezed in, let's say, a week, month, 3 months. And so inevitably, the depth of knowledge of the piece is less obviously leaving the traces in the soul and the mind that it would if it would take longer to let it become a musical immersion in the piece, in your own awareness of the piece, that you speak it like your own words, and if even if it's the notes of the composer, you feel like it's your own notes. If you can solfege it, it helps. But if it can't, then the pitches, and if not, the fingers. In other words, as many ways to get to the awareness of the flow of the events that the composer invented and enter in the DNA of the musical thought of the composer, why this comes after the next, and how the following will come after the preceding, and make it in the statement of your performance not only a recitation as it is by essence, but it becomes a restatement because it has been really appropriated as if your own. Oh, that's ideal, of course, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's a struggle that is necessary to be aware of, because if you only practice repetitively for the mechanics of it, through the fingers and the muscular memory, that cognitive fact is not enough to cover all. And therefore you have to have several layers of the knowledge of the piece that interact in your continuous stream of thoughts that has to happen while you play it. Thank you.